sure many of you know, Selfie was the word of the year for 2013. As well, for anybody who follows kind of pop culture discourse around feminism, there was a huge backlash in the last few months following an article that was published on Jezebel characterizing selfies as anti-feminist, and those who take and post them as crying for help. So this is kind of the maiden voyage of a smaller part of a greater work that is my attempt to more critically engage with this debate of feminism and anti-feminism within selfies. Specifically, I'm interested in the role of sex, sexiness, sexuality, and agency within these photographs. So I'm interested in issues of visual representation and agency as related to this burgeoning trend of taking and publicly posting self-portraits or selfies online, specifically through social media and sharing sites. I'm questioning what has caused this pictorial turn. Is this simply a rise in narcissism, a cry for validation in the eyes of our peers, or a cry for help? Or instead, could it be a platform for promoting positive self-image and self-worth? Susan Sontag, on photography, writes that to photograph people is to violate them by seeing them as they never see themselves, and by having knowledge of them that they can never have. It turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed. How does this implication change in instances of self-portraiture? Or are we all, as self-framed performances, is it possible to set the narrative by which these images will be consumed? Or are all representational mediums dominated by the hegemony of male gaze and thus framed and valued by it? Specifically, I'm interested in selfies as instances of self-constructed sexiness. Is this new trend evidence of a greater degree of sexual agency and self-determination amongst young women, or is it simply a reiteration of a previously existing cycle of hypersexualization that is simultaneously coercive and punitive? What radical potential, if any, exists in the act of self-framing and then display? So initial questions that arise from viewing this veritable slew of female selfies that now populate the internet revolve around the undeniable sexy/sexual nature that homogenizes, or seems to homogenize, these images. Questions lie in the ambiguity and the resulting tension of the simultaneously connecting and dividing sexy/sexual. Simply put, sexy can be seen as a socio-cultural normative standard that has co-opted beauty down to commodity. This beauty is seen as being essential to positively valence femininity, and it has distilled any further notions of sexuality down to this commodity as well. In contrast, sexuality can be seen as originating in the individual and evolving through a matter of sexually or socially and historically specific material practices and relationships. These are contingent and dynamic, and thus potentially a matter of political struggle. So sexuality is neither wholly outside the realm of power nor wholly circumscribed by it. Extrapolating this notion suggests a parallel with the subject-object binary. Although it is impossible to declare an authentic version of the sexual self, sexuality contains elements of subjecthood, while the sexy is equated with an object status. Rosalind Gill notes that there exists a new femininity that is organized around sexual confidence and autonomy, and the resulting tension is a struggle between sexual subjectification and objectification. My question is whether the two are mutually exclusive, or if it is possible for a woman to take pleasure in positioning herself as object. To some degree, we all self-objectify on a daily basis simply by choosing how to materially present ourselves to the world day to day. What power, if any, is inherent in this choice? In speaking of an embodied power that defines this binaristic characterization, Foucault has stressed that power is not oppositional, not divided into the binary of ruler and ruled. Instead, power runs through the social body as a whole. These relations are linked together in the micropolitics of bodies. In this matter, it is impossible to frame the construction of sexual power as being entirely constituted by hegemony and then enforced through hierarchical delineation. There exist constant renegotiations, ruptures, and reconstructions of this norm. Like Dussarteau's notion of tactic versus strategy, there exists a potential for subtle challenge to the dominant through subversive implementation of existing structures. The possibility for poaching, quote, a practice that involves taking enough from the dominant to slip under the radar screen, using the dominant against the dominant without actually challenging the status quo, end quote. suggests that a complete rejection of hegemonic structures is not absolutely necessary for resistance. In this manner, I posit that the act of self-framing involved in taking a selfie may be able to operate to cause a rift or a lapse or a disconnect in this binaristic model associated with the viewership of the female body as image. The combined power of intention and the nature of the framed image. The fact that, as James Elkins states, images sometimes stare back at us and so upset our equilibrium or even repel our view. This can challenge the traditional power dynamic of viewership and the characterization of the female body as object without subjecthood. Before considering the act of choosing to self-objectify, one must first interrogate the conditions that form the social environment for this choice. Gill denies that the shift to self-objectification is free from the prescriptions of male hegemony. Instead, this choice is simply a mutated form of the binary. To quote, "What this shift entails is a move from an external male judging gaze to a self-policing narcissistic gaze. I would argue that it represents a higher or deeper form of exploitation than objectification, one in which the objectifying male gaze is internalized to form a new disciplinary regime. This representational practice offers women the promise of power by becoming an object of desire, and endows women with the status of active subjecthood so that they can choose to become sex objects because this suits their liberated interests. In this way, sexual objectification can be presented not as something done to women by some men, but as the freely chosen wish of active, confident, and assertive female subjects," end quote. So this notion of free choice is subsumed into this insidious internalization of a panopticon, and the tyranny of sexiness remains. Female gratification and attainment are measured against how closely one's physical appearance is in accordance with an ideal, a homogenized standard of perfection. Women compete with each other to be this stereotype in order to procure their own pleasure, success, power, advancement as objects of desire, despite the consequences of this action. Their public presence becomes a threefold tussle between their self to the other, and the gaze. A second weakness in this argument for self-objectification as an avenue of power lies in the exclusive nature of the premise. Although the act of objectification can be appropriated by the women as objects themselves, this is only an available tactic to the women who already fall into the normative definition of sexiness. Some women are allowed to self-construct as active, sexually desiring objects. Women who exist outside the mainstream, idealized norms of beauty continue to be relegated to the realms of the non-sexual. Additionally, selfies, they identify a possible pitfall of the photographic medium itself. Photography can denote passivity and a validation. To quote Sontag again, it is a way of at least tacitly, often explicitly, encouraging whatever is going on to keep happening. It maintains the status quo by literally freezing the object as an unchanging signifier incapable of action. So if the act of permanently capturing sexy images is inescapably trapped in notions of objectification, can the intentionality of framing layer simultaneous subjecthood over the act? Can these images be seen as citational and contingent rather than being trapped in a hegemony of signification? Is it possible to co-opt the forms as a means of subverting the presented sexy subject? Another sexualized form of female representation which attempts to transgressively manipulate these structures is burlesque. Burlesque allows the erotic scenarios of desiring to be desired by others, and even desiring oneself to be explored in a very controlled, safe environment. This element of desire is manifested and manipulated through the use of the gaze. Burlesque researcher Jackie Wilson asserts that burlesque is aware of the fact that it treads a dangerous ground between reinforcing structures of the gaze and challenging these structures. And it's this knowingness, a phrase that she coins, that allows the form to openly question the environment that has produced this structure. Burlesque engages with the subject-object binary through the open acknowledgement and willing adoption of the role of the object. It is the act of looking that fixes something as a powerless object. It is an internal force. The action of purposely casting oneself in the role of the object, of self-objectifying, removes this power of external categorization from the subject, even though it is superficially reinforcing the linearity of the binary. The woman acknowledges her transition into status of object, and instead of being skewered into this position by the imposition of the gaze, she gives permission to look, rendering the audience a partner in the pleasure of looking instead of an external oppressor. To quote, "By looking the spectator in the eye and smiling, she is mocking, teasing, and challenging the spectator, as well as pleasurably and effectively affirming. making a spectacle out of her desiring and desirable self. She wants to be looked at, passively and vulnerably to succumb to the spectator's power and pleasure. But with this to be looked at-ness is married a powerful, questioning, humorous smile and wink, which thwarts and pulverizes the totality of anonymous and aloof control. The subversion of the piece rests on this combination of satire and sexiness, end quote. Now, the problem in transposing the structure of burlesque onto the form of the selfie lies in the difficulty of assuming intent with any of these images. Critical self-reflection is a challenge to prove. In burlesque terms, there's no evidence of knowingness, no wink to the viewer. Instead, they often operate to reinforce the very structure that shapes their objectified constitution. So while acknowledging these fundamental flaws in the subjective nature of the selfie, it's hasty to outrightly dismiss the whole phenomenon on this basis. And this would be the crux of my problem with a lot of the debate that's happening around selfies and this anti-feminist formulation of them. There exist radical attempts to co-opt selfies in the periphery. One such example is an alternate Tumblr page entitled The Female Form. In addition to art and writing that relates messages of body positivity and freedom of physical expression, the site contains selfies that are representative of a wide-ranging demographic. So far from aligning with an idealized beauty, the page constructs individual physicality as beauty. These images do not avoid sexiness, but work to redefine what and who is allowed to be sexy. These images, while themes typical to the selfie form still appear, so we still see this compartmentalizing of body parts, hyperfemininity, the images represent difference and not conformity. In fact, the choice to frame traditionally conceived flaws such as stretch marks and wrinkles and body hair, this shifts the perceptual meaning of value that's associated with choosing a body part to stand in as a representation of the whole self. So the synecdochic element of choosing something that's conventionally conceived as a flaw changes the value associated with the picture as a whole. So a deviation from the traditionally silent image of the selfie can also be found in the titling and self-commentary that accompany these images. Following the image, for example, following the image of a naked, blue-haired, full-figured woman who makes direct eye contact with the viewer is the commendation. Selfies are an excellent form of self-love and care. Take as many as you want. This page declares that the taking and posting of a selfie is an act of subjecthood, a radical declaration of self-determination. There is pleasure and power to be found in this choice. The intention is inherent in the act and fortified by the subject's own words to further frame the image. So they're curated in such a way as to get this notion. In this manner, the selfie to some degree realizes its potential as a vehicle for agency for poaching the hegemonic structure. So in conclusion, rather than offering concrete answers to questions about power and pleasure and subjecthood, I hope to have opened up the argument beyond an oppositional binaristic understanding by illuminating a little bit of the complexity of the issue at work and teasing out potential cracks in a hegemonically determinative structure. So rather than close down a conversation with a value judgment or condemnation of the whole of the basis of the most prevalent manifestation of selfie culture, kind of a rejection of this regurgitative sexiness, I would suggest an approach of modest optimism based upon the ruptures in structure that are already occurring. Additionally, the backlash tendency to completely discount one of the few mediums that affords marginalized women the privilege of visibility as not feminist is elitist, narrow-minded, and only works to further alienate and exclude the women for whom this is potentially the sole avenue of publicly owning their sexual agency. To end with a quote from Diana Taylor, she writes that it is not enough to point out that certain roles and representations have negative or limiting implications for social subjects. Rather, the challenge lies in understanding and conceivably modifying the productions of subjectivity through those roles and representations, through their ability to highlight modes of visibility or invisibility, their construction of positionality, and hence destiny. Thank you.